it is an honor and a privilege to be here with you this morning for a number of reasons. Obviously, as Brian said, I lead Campus Focus, which is good for you all to know because Campus Focus is the college ministry of the chapel. And so, as you heard, I wasn't expecting that, but I appreciate that. A couple of students that are here are part of Campus Focus on Thursday nights. This is their home church, but they come to Campus Focus and are able to be fed and be in community that way too. And so what's really cool for me is I came into this morning, I knew that there was going to be a baptism. I didn't know who it was. I actually had just met Anna this past Thursday for the very first time. And so it was really cool for me to be surprised, pleasantly surprised walking in that she was actually getting baptized. So congrats again. That was really exciting to be a part of. But also, I actually grew up here in Wadsworth myself. I went to Wadsworth High School. I graduated in 2009, and so for me to be here anyway to preach the word is a big deal, but especially because Wadsworth is home to me. So thank you for having me here this morning. But we are not here to talk about me. I could go on and on about that. We are here to dig into God's word, specifically the life of the prophet Elisha. And so we're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 4. If you'd like to get ahead and join me there, please. 2 Kings chapter 4. Before we dig into 2 Kings, I want to acknowledge something. The Old Testament can be difficult to read. It can be difficult to understand, and it can be difficult to relate to. We spend the majority of our time reading and studying the New Testament, understandably so, but the Old Testament is equally God's Word. So if we were to begin a story and open the book 3/4 of the way through, I will be able to get a grasp on what's happening at that time, but it will be incomplete because what happened in the first 3/4 of the story provides context for what I'm experiencing at the 3/4 mark. So one of the reasons that God has given us the Old Testament is so that we may understand the beginning of the redemptive story that He has written for us. Right? This is a story that all of us are a part of. And so understanding where we've been helps us understand where we are at now. God has given us the Old Testament so that we may know the history of creation, but also so that we may better know His character and better know ourselves, because even thousands of years later, we can see ourselves here. We can see ourselves in even the Old Testament. And more importantly, we can see Jesus. Because this whole book, this whole story, all of the Bible is actually about Him. My hope is to make that clear for all of us this morning. And so here's our plan of attack. We're going to spend the first portion of our morning just simply reading and understanding what's happening in 2 Kings chapter 4. And I'm just telling you, this is a long story. Like, this is a big story, so track with me. We're going to be in the story, really digging in for a little bit before we start talking about application. Once we understand what it is that God is showing us through this, or what God is showing us about these people, these figures in this story, then we can begin to say, what does this mean for us? So once we understand what it meant for them, we can then ask, what does it mean for us? Cool? Cool. Even if you said no, that's how we're rolling with it. 2 Kings chapter 4, beginning in verse 8. One day Elisha went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, "Behold now, I know that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there." So we're going to pause there for a moment. These first 3 verses set the stage for us very simply. As Elisha traveled, he apparently passed through this particular area regularly. So this woman opened up her home to him to feed him, which would have been a common form of hospitality in this culture. Right? As people are traveling and constantly, they're not driving cars, they're constantly walking everywhere, often long distances, and so people would open up their homes and just to be hospitable, would provide and feed and take care of them. Now, what would have been uncommon in this culture is that a woman would be wealthy. That's just the way that this culture at the time was. And interestingly enough, What we're reading here runs parallel, and yet kind of opposite, to the encounter right before this one involving the widow's oil, which if you were here 2 weeks ago, you would have seen, Pastor Zach would have brought in that. But in the first one, Elisha encounters a woman who is poor and is a widow. This one, he encounters a woman who is wealthy and has a husband. And so we can see some parallels happening here. The theme is the same between the two, in that God provides, but the circumstances are vastly different. And what I want to point out is that this is one of many occurrences in the Bible where God's care and concern for the hurting and for the marginalized is being highlighted. And we will see that as we move forward in this story. But over time, as Elisha would regularly stop there and eat, this woman recognized that he was a holy man of God. And if you think about it, this makes sense. I would imagine that she didn't know that much about him when she first opened up their home to be hospitable. But over time, the more time you spend with somebody, the more time you get to know them, you learn more about them. And so over time, she realizes, wow, there's something different about this guy. He's a prophet. This is a prophet of God. He's a holy man of God. Holy means to be set apart. And so after she saw him as holy and set apart for God, she wanted to give him a space that was holy and set apart in their home. Right? She recognized that there was something different about him, and so even though he was being welcomed into their common space, she said, to reflect this holiness, he needs his own place as even set apart in our very own home. And this is the first of several instances where this woman's faith is being displayed. She saw Elisha as a blessing to God's people, and so she desired to be a blessing to him. So that sets the stage for us really well. Verse 11, we continue on. One day he, Elisha, came there, and he turned into the chamber and rested there. And he said to Gehazi, his servant, call this Shunammite. And when he had called her, she stood before him. And he said to him, say now to her, see, you have taken all this trouble for us. What is to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? And she answered, I dwell among my own people. So she blessed Elisha by having a room built for him and feeding him because of the blessing that he is from God. And here, Elisha wants to bless her for blessing him. This looks like what I would call a humility battle. I like to say that I coined this phrase. I probably did not, but I know that you're familiar with what a humility battle is because we all do this dance. And what I mean is, I'll give you an example. You're walking into a place and you open the door for somebody. And of course, you can see that they're grateful for it. But instead of them just walking in the door, they stop and they say, oh no, after you. And then you kind of do this dance back and forth of like, well, are you going to go? Wait a second. Wouldn't it be so much easier if I opened the door for you if you would just walk through it and let me serve you? But instead, you're going to battle my humility with your humility and saying, you go first. That is a humility battle. And what's funny about that is humility says, I'm going to allow you to serve me. And, this is a complete side. This is a different sermon. But, it is actually prideful for us to not allow someone to, in humility, be served, right? When we don't allow people to serve us and we say, I'm going to one-up you this way, that is actually pride speaking. This looks like a humility battle, but I'm not convinced that it is. I actually believe that this is a prime example of outdoing one another in love, just as Scripture calls us to. We are blessed to be a blessing. And so we don't bless others to be blessed in return, but in God's economy, blessing and obedience breeds blessing and obedience. So Elisha wants to bless her in return, but when he asks what he could do for her, she says, I dwell among my own people. In other words, I'm not displaced from my home. I have everyone and I have everything that I could ever need. This demonstrates her contentment, her lack of need, and humility. She was wealthy and lacked nothing to live, which is in stark contrast to the poor widow previous to this. But Elisha's persistent. Verse 14, and he said, what then is to be done for her? Gehazi answered, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. He said, call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway, and he said, at this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. And she said, no, my Lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant. Okay, let's look at this for a moment. In this moment, we learn that she does have a need, doesn't she? Right? Before she responded, essentially, I have no need, but here we clearly see that she does have a need. She does have a want. God, the way that Gehazi introduces this is that she is unable to bear a child. She has no son, which means she is barren. She's unable to actually bear a child. And then similarly, he says, and her husband is old. The implication is because she cannot bear a child, because she is barren, and because her husband is a little bit older and will be dying sooner rather than later, he is going to be left without an heir. In other words, the family line was going to end. These two things, barrenness and the fact that the family line was going to end in this culture, was a mark of shame. And so she had felt this, she had been feeling this, she'd been dealing with this. And yet we see there was actually a need. And so Elisha comes back and tells her that she will bear a son. And her response tells us two things. First, it's clear that it's something that she has longed for, because she's telling Elisha, don't tell me something like this unless it will truly happen. Right? Don't get my hopes up and don't leave me disappointed. But her response also makes it clear that she had come to terms with the fact that bearing a child was impossible for her. I mean, think about it. When Elisha asked what she wanted done for her, why didn't she take that opportunity to express her desire for a child? She clearly had faith in God and knew that he blessed his people. So why not ask? Well, I have a theory on this as to why she did not ask, but we're going to have to save that for a little bit later. I believe that we withhold our wants and needs from God for the same reason that she does here. But we're going to circle back to that. We want to focus on the story first, okay? So hang tight. What happens next? Verse 17, but the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time the following spring, as Elisha had said to her. So what we see here, God makes a promise, and God fulfills it. He does the same thing today. God makes a promise, and he fulfills it. Right? This is actually similar to the account of Sarah and Abraham. Both Abraham and Sarah, old in age, unable to bear children, and yet Abraham is promised, hey, you will be a father of many nations. Right? Your descendants will outnumber the grains of sand, the stars in the sky. And they're like, how can this happen? And God tells Abraham, well, Sarah, your wife, will bear a child. And she overhears this and she even laughs because she's like, I can't believe that. There's no way. And yet God was good on that promise as well. So what she, this Shunammite woman, considered to be impossible was made possible by God. Then we get to verse 18, which is actually several years later. We'll see how we know that in a moment. When the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. And he said to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." The father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." And when she had lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and shut the door behind him, and went out. Then she called to her husband and said, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again." And he said, "Why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath." And she said, "All is well." Then she saddled the donkey, and she said to her servant, "Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." Okay, so we are told that this child had grown. And the fact that he's talking tells us that several years had passed by between verses 17 and verse 18. The son that she never expected to have in the first place dies, likely due to sunstroke or something very similar to that from being outside. Regardless, he dies in her lap. I have no doubt in my mind that she is hurting and that she is feeling all kinds of emotions, but we don't really see that displayed in this moment. Instead, she does some things that are a little odd given the circumstances. Right? You would think that the moment that her son dies, she would go to her husband and say, "Look at what has happened." But she doesn't do that. Instead, she goes upstairs in Elisha's room, places the child on the bed, and closes the door behind her, away from everybody else, so that no one would see what has happened. She goes to her husband and says, "Hey, I got to go see Elisha. Let's get some things together. I need to go quickly." And she still has not told him to this point what has happened. And so he goes, "Well, why would you do this today?" And the significance of being the new moon or the Sabbath would be on those two different times would be when Elisha, the prophet of God, would not actively be doing the work of God. And so to go to the man of God outside of those times was to disturb what he was doing. And so he's like, "Why would you go at a time that is not appropriate?" And her response is, "All is well." Was all well? Clearly, all is not well here. So why does she not tell her husband about their son and say all is well? I'm not trying to justify her actions here, but if she were to tell her husband what happened, there would be a chance that he would prevent her from leaving, right? It wouldn't be appropriate for her then, after mourning the loss of their son, to go out and go see Elisha. So he may have prevented her from leaving. And even if not, this wouldn't have been a short conversation. This would have been a long conversation between them, obviously. She's operating with a sense of urgency. And she knows that her husband can't do anything about this. Right? Her husband is not the one who she needs to talk to because he can't do anything. But she believes that Elisha can. And we've all felt this sense of urgency before. When there's like someone that we know we need to talk to, we know who it is that we need to see for something to take place. And then we get like caught up in these lesser conversations. Like at the doctor's office, I need to see the doctor. Maybe you're in the ER room. I need to see the doctor, someone who actually could do something about what I'm here for. I don't want to talk to the person at the front desk. I don't want to even talk to the nurse. I want to skip because there's a sense of urgency. I want to talk to the person who I know can actually really fully take care of what's going on. All right? So we get impatient. Right? If I'm at a restaurant or if I'm at a store and there's something that has gone wrong, I don't know that talking to the cashier is really going to help a ton. I want to talk to the manager. I want to talk to the one who has something that can actually take care of what it is that I'm dealing with. And so she's resolving, Elisha's my guy. Elisha's the one that can do something about this. And so I need to get to him. We felt that urgency before. And this urgency to get to Elisha is just another expression of her faith. Right? The impossible had been done before when she thought that she couldn't bear a child. Perhaps she believed that the impossible could be done again. Pick up in verse 25. So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. And when the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, 'Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child?' And she answered, 'All is well.'" So Elisha knows that something is wrong, clearly. He spots her from afar. And he says, "Gehazi, you're younger than me. You're fast. Go see what she needs. Go see what's going on." And he comes to her and he goes, is everything okay? What's going on? Because again, it would be odd for her to be approaching him in a time that is not the new moon or the Sabbath. Well, Gehazi asks her these questions, and we know that all is not well, and yet what does she say to Gehazi? All is well. Why does she do this? Because in verse 27, when she came to the mountain to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet. And Gehazi came to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress. And the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." Then she said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" To this point, she had been composed. At least on appearance, she had been fairly composed given the circumstances. But the moment she gets to the ones who she wanted to get to, the moment she got to Elisha, it just all came out. She grabbed hold of his feet. She dropped to the ground and grabbed hold of his feet, which was a sign of desperation. Actually, to do this is to put yourself, it's a humbling thing, but again, in this culture, it would have been humiliating to do this. But all the emotions are coming out. And we see her raw expression in verse 28. She says, "Did I ask for a son?" In other words, I didn't ask for this in the first place. And she says, "I told you not to deceive me." In other words, it would have been better if you had not given me a son in the first place because of all the hurt and the pain that I'm feeling right now. And in this interaction, she doesn't explicitly say, "My son has died," but Elisha puts two and two together. And he recognizes what has happened. And even though this could be her reaction, almost like, "I told you not to deceive me, I didn't ask for this," right? That could be misconstrued as like, "Hey, do we talk to a prophet like that? Do we talk to a man of God like that?" And Elisha noticed that he doesn't rebuke her. He doesn't say that she shouldn't be feeling what she's feeling. He doesn't do any of that. Instead, we see action. He said to Gehazi, "Tie up your garment, take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not reply. And lay my staff on the face of the child." Then the mother of the child said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So he arose and followed her. But Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or sign of life. Therefore, he returned to meet him, Elisha, and told him, "The child has not awakened." So now we see it's not only this woman who has this sense of urgency, but we also see now Elisha has this sense of urgency. He goes, "Hey, we need to do something about this." And so knowing that he and this woman would not be able to get there that fast, he says, "Gehazi, you go." And notice that he says, if someone comes to greet you, he essentially says, ignore them. Don't even talk to them. Don't you wish sometimes that we had that directive, right? Like, when I'm in a hurry, I don't want to talk to people, right? But in this particular culture, this would be really odd. Like, this is weird. It is common practice to be hospitable. It is common practice as you're traveling to actually stop and engage with people, greet them. But something's different here, right? He tells Gehazi, "Hey, no, skip all of those formalities. You need to go do this." And he gave him his staff, which is a symbol of the prophet's authority and power. And so Elisha's thinking, maybe I don't even need to be there. Maybe if Gehazi takes the staff and lays it on the face of the child, this child will be raised from the dead. We obviously see that does not happen. And so as Elisha and this woman are still going slowly, they're taking their time for whatever reason, Gehazi has enough time to get back to them and meets them and says, "Hey, this ultimately doesn't work." And so when Elisha came into the house, verse 32, he saw the child laying dead on his bed. And so he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Okay, so in faith, this woman believed Elisha, being a man of God, was the one who could do something. And in faith, Elisha recognizes that his power and authority doesn't come from himself, but the Lord. So before attempting anything else, what does he do? He prays. How many of us, knowing that we can do something, that we can come, we sprint into action and we don't take a moment to say, "All right, God, this is all from you. I'm a vessel, but I need to stop and pray." Elisha recognizes that nothing that he does can be done apart from the Lord. And so he stops and he prays. And then it gets a little bit weird. God is about to work a miracle, but how it happens will make us wonder what in the world is going on. All right? My charge here is not to let how God works distract us from what God works. All right? I'm warning you. Here we go. Here's what happens. Verse 34. After praying, then he went up and lay on the child. putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And as he stretched himself upon him, the flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again and walked once back and forth in the house, probably praying, and went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite." And so he called her, and when she came to him, he said, "Pick up your son." And she came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground, and then she picked up her son and went out. All right, I told you it was about to be weird. I mean, it's tempting for us to get caught up on Elisha stretching himself on top of a dead body. Like, I get it. But the point is not the how. The point is the what. God did what seemed to be impossible yet again and made it possible. God took someone who had died and raised them to life. That is exactly where our attention should be in this story. And the number 7, if you didn't know, in the Bible, it means completion. It indicates a work of God. So when the child sneezes, it seems random, right? When the child sneezes 7 times, we're being told that this work of God has been completed. So this woman receives back her son, who she thought was dead, who she thought that she could never have in the first place. This is a fascinating story. The question is, why does God give us this? Right? He's purposeful, he's intentional, this is his word. So we can't walk away thinking that what we've read has no bearing on us today. There are 2 key figures in 2 Kings 4 who serve as examples for us and show us who God is. The first is the Shunammite woman. And something that we can rightly observe is that steady faith manifests itself in the mundane. Steady faith manifests itself in the mundane. Here's something to remember, not just for this morning, but just throughout as we go about our lives. What we know about God informs how we respond to him. What we know, what we believe about God will inform how we respond to him. So this woman, all throughout this story, her faith is evident. Really from the start, the very fact that she recognized Elisha as a holy man of God, she sought to bless him because she clearly believed that God is a God of blessing, and so she decided to bless him in return. We see that even after, right, recognizing he's a holy man of God, builds this room in her own home for him. After she bears a child and loses this child, even though we may not agree, we may not fully understand why she did what she did, not telling her husband, she went to Elisha because she believed that God could do something about it. Like, we see her faith evident throughout this story. What we believe about God will show up in our everyday living. Not just the big things, but the small things, the seemingly mundane things. She saw God as a God who blesses, and so she in turn wanted to bless someone else. If we know God to be a God who brings blessing, we will want to do the same, and it will show up in even the most subtle of gestures. We don't bless others to be blessed in return, but because we've experienced the blessings of God ourselves, because that's who he is. He gives us his grace in big ways and little ways, ways that we do not deserve, and we need to have our eyes open to even just the little things that he does for us. That's who he is. We also see that deep faith can coexist with grief and desperation. You know, we often feel this tension where if I'm hurting and I'm grieving over the loss of someone or something that I care about, it feels wrong. Right? It feels like grief and desperation are the opposite of faith. But I would remind you that God grieves. God mourns. He grieves over sin and its effects on creation. The Psalms are littered with examples of David primarily getting pretty raw with God about the grief and the desperation that he's feeling. Right? He expresses both deep desperation and deep faith. This Shunammite woman expresses both deep desperation and deep faith. She saw God do the impossible in giving her a child, and that surely strengthened her faith. But when she saw Elisha after her child died, how did she respond? She grabbed his feet in desperation and said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I say, 'Do not deceive me'?" She says, "I did not ask for this. It would have been better for you to not give me a son in the first place if you were only going to take him away. It would have saved the heartache." This is undoubtedly a point in the story where it might hit differently for some here this morning. Some of you ladies here this morning, perhaps you've experienced barrenness. Perhaps you're currently in a season of barrenness, you wanting and desiring a child, but unable to attain that. Perhaps you have experienced it in the past, but the Lord has blessed you with that. Perhaps you're here this morning and you have experienced the loss of a child. And so this is a story that hits home for you. I cannot imagine what you have gone through or what you are going through. But God can. God knows. What I want you to know this morning is that just as God saw and heard the grief and desperation of Sarah and this woman, he sees and hears you in your hurt as well. Knowing that God sees us in our hurt, he hears us in our hurt, it doesn't change the fact that the hurt exists, but it does change what we do with it. What this woman did with her deep desperation was bring it to God. She didn't come to Elisha just to tell him how much he's hurting. She came to him because she believed God could do something about it through him, which is actually an expression of deep faith. Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 4 that we are to be people who grieve, yes, but with hope. Because he's a God who sees us, hears us, and understands our hurt, we are able to run to him with both grief and faith. He can handle it. We can turn to him. We also see here that big faith is the result of knowing a big God. This woman's faith grew from the beginning of this story to the end. Remember that Elisha asked her what she wanted done for her, and she responded by, in essence, saying, "Nothing. I'm content. I have everything that I need." But she was unable to bear children. So again, why didn't she take the opportunity to ask for that? Well, perhaps at that time, her faith in God was not yet big enough for her to make an ask like that. Right? She had already resolved in her mind that it was impossible for her to bear children, so she may have felt like it wasn't worth the ask. How many of us here this morning have chosen not to ask God for something that we need or desire because we believe it is too big of an ask? How many of us would identify something that we need, something that we want, and we'd say, yeah, it kind of borderlines on the impossible. There's no way he would answer this, so we don't bother asking him in the first place. How many of us do that? She didn't ask for a child because she felt like it was impossible. And yet, God made what she believed to be impossible possible, and she bore a child. And here's how we know her faith grew by story's end. After her child dies, she doesn't give up. With a sense of urgency, she goes to Elisha because she believes that God can do something about it. Right? Which do you believe is more impossible? Opening the womb of a barren woman or raising someone from the dead? Both seem pretty impossible, but I think the easy answer is raising someone from the dead. Before, she wasn't even willing to ask for the less impossible of the two. But by story's end, she's asking for what's most impossible. So what changed? Well, she saw God do the impossible before, right? Taking away her barrenness. So she believed that God could do the impossible again. She saw God be faithful here. And so she believed that God can and will be faithful here. And God used her desperate circumstances as a platform for his faithfulness, which resulted in her faith in him growing. And it reminds me from an encounter, from a few lines in the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Prince Caspian. We have this exchange between Aslan and Lucy. Aslan, who is a lion and the Christ figure of this story from C.S. Lewis. Lucy and Aslan are having this conversation, and Lucy says, "Aslan, you're bigger." And Aslan responds, "That is because you are older, little one." And she goes, "Well, not because you are," as in like Aslan, "not because you're older." And he says, "I am not. But every year that you grow, you will find me bigger." Okay. So the longer we spend time with Jesus, the more that we spend time with him and see the faithfulness of God, our view of him will grow. And as our view of him grows, so will our faith. And that means that we'll be willing to make the impossible asks, not because he is going to give us whatever we ask, but because he can. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says this on the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him?" God desires for us to bring our wants and desires to him. We are given an invitation, right? Seek, ask, knock. And we're also given a promise that he will answer. He may not answer in the exact way that we want, but he will answer always according to his will. And we're also promised that whatever it is we're given, however he answers our ask, it will be good because he is good. I don't believe that this woman knew for certain that God would raise her child from the dead. But we know by the very fact that she came to him that she believed he could. And that should be our posture towards God. God, I don't know if you will, but I know that you can. God, I don't know if you will answer this prayer. I don't know if this thing I'm bringing before you, if you will answer it. But I know that you can. If we see God as a big God, we will bring him the big asks, trusting that however he responds will be for our good and for his glory. Now, there is one other key figure in this story that shows us who God is and who we are. Remember the way that Elisha raised this woman's son from the dead? He stretched himself over the child's body twice, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. Okay, this is odd for a number of reasons, but especially because anyone that touches a dead body makes themselves unclean, according to the Old Testament law. Right? Elisha is a prophet and holy man of God, so fully covering this child's dead body with his own. By doing that, he's bringing what is holy and what is unclean together. But in doing so, the dead is brought back to life. Can you think of anywhere else where the holy completely covered the dead and unclean in order to raise it to life? Isn't that exactly what Jesus has done for us? He himself, being perfect and holy, has stretched himself, fully covered over us, what is dead, sinful, and unclean. We begin in a state of spiritual deadness, in rebellion to God, stuck in our sin, unable to do anything about it. But just as Elisha fully covered this child's physical deadness, Jesus fully covers us in our sin and spiritual deadness. And just as Elisha willingly made himself unclean to raise this child to life, Jesus willingly exchanged his perfection for our sin so that we may be raised to life. We look around today And although we may not see the dead physically being raised to life, it is clear that God is still in the business of raising the dead to life. It's clear that God takes what is spiritually dead and broken, and he's still in the business of taking that and raising it to life. If you were a follower of Jesus, you were once like this child, dead in your trespasses and sin. But as Ephesians tells us, Ephesians 2, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. Pastor Zach said this a few weeks ago, but this entire book, all of the Bible, it's about Jesus. The gospel is not limited to just the New Testament, because we see it right here in 2 Kings chapter 4. This was a real child who was really dead, but this was also a foreshadow of what was to come. We are given stories like this to show us who God is and what he has done, so that we may know him more, see him bigger, and trust him, and that he will do what he will do both now and forever. He was in the business of raising the dead to life then, and he is still in the business of raising the dead to life today. He has not changed. Back then, he was in the business of raising the dead to life, and he's still in the business of raising the dead to life today. So as the band comes back up to lead us, I would like to lead us in a short time of prayer to that end. As you've done these past few weeks, this is going to be a time to pray together for one another, as well as the various families that you have signed up to pray for AWAKEN. And so if you have a list of families, this would be the time to get that out. And if you don't, if you're a guest here, that's okay. What I will lead us in will allow you to pray for others off the top of your head. And if you don't pray at all, if this is all new to you, I want to just encourage you, hang back and just observe. If this is uncomfortable for you, just observe what we are doing here together, because we believe, as it says here, that God is a God who hears us and sees us. And so we have access to him, and he invites us to pray to him. And so I'm going to lead us in praying with three focuses in mind. And the first is God himself. We're going to begin by simply praising him. We're going to begin by simply acknowledging him for who he is. How has God revealed himself to you through this story? Perhaps it's his faithfulness. Perhaps it's the fact that you are reminded that he is a God who raises the dead to life. Maybe he's done that in your own life. Maybe he has seen you and heard you in a place of hurt, and he has restored you. So let's just take a few moments acknowledging God for who he is, and asking and thanking him for who he is. Silently together, let's spend a few moments just praying to God and thanking him. Let's do that now.
This has been a message from the chapel. Thanks for joining us today. For more information about the chapel or any of our campuses, including Akron, Greene, Wadsworth, Kenmore, Cuyahoga Falls, Nordonia, and Medina, please go to our website at thechapel.life.